this case, the Green River Killer takes its name from a river in Seattle that flows through the state of Washington. In 1982, during a 6-month span of time, 5 bodies of females were found in or near the Green River area. These individuals were strangled and raped, and upon investigation said to be known prostitutes who were from the area. Police concentrated on the location known as the SeaTac Strip, which was a gathering place for prostitutes. Girls were mysteriously disappearing from this area at an alarming rate. On April 30th, 1983, the boyfriend of a prostitute saw her enter a truck with a customer and the vehicle quickly speeding away. He tried to follow them but lost track of the truck. He never saw his girlfriend again after she entered the truck. About a week later, he spotted the same truck in the area where his girlfriend was picked up. He followed it to a location believed as was the driver's home and immediately contacted the police department. Police questioned the driver of the truck, Gary Ridgway, who had claimed he didn't see the missing prostitute. He agreed to take a polygraph test and passed, so he was removed from the police suspect list. By 1986, 40 female bodies were found, and law enforcement believed they were all murdered by a serial killer that they were now calling the Green River Killer. In 1987, Ridgway was again a person of interest in the Green River murders. He was picked up for choking a prostitute, soliciting an undercover police officer, and on one occasion when he was stopped for questioning, he was actually with one of the victims in his truck. Police noticed a pattern that each time a woman went missing, Ridgway was either absent from work or had not completed his shift that day. On April 8, 1987, a warrant was issued to search Ridgway's residence and to get a saliva sample from him. Once again, they did not have sufficient evidence to hold him, and he was released. For approximately 10 years, no additional bodies were discovered and the case lay dormant. In 2001, DNA testing was being used, and this prompted investigators to reopen the case. Semen samples were collected from the 3 victims of the Green River Killer, and it was then compared to the saliva sample that was collected from Gary Ridgway back in 1987. The DNA profiles were a match, and the police now had cause to arrest Ridgway. Police arrested Ridgway and charged him with murder. His attorney was going to use the defense that the only thing the DNA proved was that Gary Ridgway was a customer of the prostitutes and nothing more. Investigators revisit the previous information on the case and found that one of the victim's boyfriends saw Gary pick up the girl in his work truck. That truck was for a painting company. They contacted Skip Palahniuk, an expert forensic infrared microscopist, to assist them in finding evidence linked to Ridgway to the victims. Investigators collected paint samples from Ridgway's car, clothes, and work locker. Paint samples were also collected from the victims. Palahniuk was asked to try and find a match. Palahniuk explained the process he used. He said, "My first step was to use the Perkin-Elmer Spectrum 1 instrument and the Auto Image FTIR microscope to generate a unique chemical fingerprint of the several thousand paint samples associated with Ridgway that had been collected by the police. These samples were approximately 1 millimeter in size. Using an infrared microscope allowed Palahniuk to examine these samples without any special preparation and without risk of damaging the samples. It was important not to damage the samples because they would be needed to provided as evidence to the defense when the case went to trial. Palahniuk then created a reference library with which to enable him to match these samples slides taken from the victims to the sample slides taken from Ridgway. An identical match was found. It was re-examined by using a high magnification polarized light microscopy to identify the pigment and then use an X-ray spectroscopy to determine the elemental composition. At this level of inspection, none of the samples stood out to be a match all the way through the analysis process. Palahniuk believed further testing needed to be done, and he requested the prosecutors provide him with clothing from both Ridgway and the victims so he could do more intense investigation. He used cassette-type filters attached to a vacuum cleaner and collected particles ranging size from 20 to 100 microns in size. This is about 1/100th of a size of the particles previously analyzed. His process was based on the fact that spray paint guns, which were used by Ridgway, generate tiny spheres of paint are so light they float in the air rather than fastening to an object being painted. This would cause them to adhere to the article of clothing. Okay. Palahniuk viewed the minute sized particles through a powerful optical microscope, picked them out with tungsten needles, placed them on a slide, and viewed them for analysis. The auto image microscope allowed Palahniuk to generate usable IR spectra from particles as small as 10 microns by 10 microns. Palahniuk found hundreds of tiny spheres in various colors on the victim's clothing, 2 of which had been linked to Ridgway through the previous DNA test of semen and saliva. The paint samples viewed were made of Imron's paint, a very rare type that was used extensively in the shop where Ridgway worked. Working with the paint manufacturer DuPont, the investigators were able to link the samples obtained from the victims with the paint that was used by Ridgway around the same time of the Green River murders. When Ridgway was confronted with the evidence found by Palahniuk, he confessed in a plea deal to murdering 48 women. In return for the plea, the prosecution would not seek the death penalty. He also agreed to tell investigators the whereabouts of his victims. On December 18, 2003, Judge Richard Jones sentenced Gary Ridgway to 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively. He was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims, giving him an additional 480 years added to his 48 life sentences. The following steps are necessary to ensure the integrity of the evidence collected. When collecting paint samples, place them in vials, metal or cardboard pill boxes, or paper bundles placed in envelopes. Do not use plastic to store this, as this can cause static electricity. Do not pack with cotton or other protective materials directly touching the samples. You must be cautious when collecting clothing from the victim. All clothing, including shoes, should be collected, dried, and packaged individually. Do not wrap these items on a table unless it has been thoroughly cleaned before use. Paint must be present as chips or smears from a large and visible to the eye, or small and minute, only visible under a microscopic condition. Loose chips should be removed and packaged in containers to avoid breakage. As a last resort, paint chips can be collected using tape lifts. Packaged in clear plastic or K-Pack bags. Do not use fingerprint lift tape for this process. It will destroy the paint chips. Label each specimen of evidence with the agency case number, item number, and brief description of each. Tape seal the container, date, and initial of the seal. Submit your evidence to the laboratory with physical evidence submission form, as well as a case report or case summary. The careful collection of paint samples allowed Palahniuk to test the samples more than 20 years later because investigators handled them properly. It should be noted that currently there is a bill before the Senate known as 5036, which allows prisoners to request commutation of their life sentence after they have served 25 years. According to Fox News in Olympic, Washington, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, could possibly be released under this bill. He would be eligible in 2028 to make his request to the Clemency and Pardons Board to commute his sentence at the time. It should be noted that although Ridgway was made to include a waiver of right to petition for clemency as a part of his plea, so he could receive the life sentence without the possible parole in lieu of facing the death penalty. This bill would now give him the right to petition for parole. Ridgway was interviewed in regards to Bill 5036, and he stated if he was released from prison, he believed he would do it again. Whether or not the Clemency Board approves the commutation of Ridgway's sentence, it would still rest in the hands of the governor of the state of Washington to ultimately decide if an individual like Gary Ridgway can be released. The three new facts I've learned from my research are: I have learned that it's very important to collect evidence with care to procedures in order to preserve the integrity of an investigation. 2. Evidence can be used many years later after it's been collected to solve a case as long as it's been preserved properly. A lie detector test is not a reliable source of information during an investigation.